Hi Honor Minds, it's Matt. If you don't remember me, I was a podcast host from season 2. I talked a lot on my season about how I'm gay, so obviously masculinity was always kind of a big thing for me, not really knowing how to navigate that. When I did my season, I was a junior in high school, and now I'm a freshman in college, and honestly, I still don't really know how to navigate masculinity and manhood and all of those different topics, to be honest. So I was wondering if you guys could do an episode on that. Thanks so much.
That was such a great voicemail message from Matt.
Yeah, of course. We can do an episode on masculinity. We got you, Matt. From PBS NewsHour's Student Reporting Labs
and WETA,
this is On Our Minds
with Bree
and James,
a podcast made by teens for teens.
Because everyone deserves a place to feel heard. Hey Bree.
Hey James, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Just occupying a lot of the free time I have these days. I'm going out a lot with my friends, going rock climbing or just staying inside crocheting. And it's really cool that we're kind of exploring that topic of masculinity these days, because it's very cool to see what things are considered like masculine and what things are considered not, as I'm like exploring a lot of new things to do. So really cool that Matt from the previous seasons reaching out to talk about that today.
I'm really glad we're exploring masculinity too. I saw that there was a NewsHour story about men and friendship, a really important topic to dive into.
American men are stuck in what's been dubbed a friendship recession, with 20% of single men now saying they don't have any close friends. And more than half of all men report feeling unsatisfied with the size of their friend groups.
With us here to talk about the research surrounding young men and their mental health is our researcher and fact checker, Simran.
Hey Simran.
Hi, it's great to be back.
Tell us what research you found.
What stands out right off the bat is the stigma around mental health for men. In general, there are a lot of societal expectations for how men should conduct themselves. For example, a 2017 study found that the majority of men ages 18 to 30 felt that they were expected to act strong despite feeling anxious or scared internally.
So what are some of the things men feel anxious or scared about?
Well, men report feeling a lot of pressure to support their families financially, be successful in their careers, and to avoid overly friendly and intimate relationships with close friends, particularly in comparison to women. Something else I found interesting was that some people categorize mental health issues as masculine and feminine. Eating disorders, for example, are perceived as more feminine, while substance use and antisocial behavior are perceived as more masculine. And oftentimes, the mental health issues that are labeled as masculine garner more stigma.
And I know friendships are a really important part of people's support system. So I was wondering, did you find any relevant information on male friendships?
It really seems that connections for a support system are just harder to come by these days, with only 27% of men reporting that they have at least 6 close friends and 15% reporting that they have none at all. This is being called a friendship recession.
How does the stigma around men's mental health relate to men being more isolated?
Well, because men hold more stigmatizing attitudes towards those with mental illness, especially younger men, they become hesitant to open themselves up and seek help. They're scared of being bullied or excluded if their peers find out. Even if they aren't shunned by their friends and family, many men end up distancing themselves to shield others from their circumstances and avoid judgment. And this isolation only perpetuates their worsening mental health.
Yeah, and I think that language plays a huge role into what we like interpret as masculinity. Growing up like as a guy, I've always like heard phrases like, man up, things like that. And so I feel like that really teaches a lot of young guys out there and even older guys to just kind of suppress what they're feeling inside. Simran, I was just curious, what can men do now to kind of combat this issue?
One of the most important things that men can do is to cultivate meaningful friendships where they feel comfortable enough not only to be vulnerable, but also to accept advice to seek professional help. As we see more and more men speak out about their personal experiences with mental health, hopefully the stigma around male mental health will improve.
All of this is super important. Thanks for joining us, Simran.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Up next, student reporter Nico asks students at his high school in Santa Clara, California, what masculinity means to them. And then he interviews Dr. Ellenberg, the founder and director of Strength with Heart men's groups. Here's Nico.
So masculinity is a word and an idea that is almost totally up to interpretation. What did the media you consume say? What did your family believe? What did you see growing up? What are your personal experiences? When I think of masculinity, I think of, I guess, the kind of man I want to be. The one that's always kind, the one who always has a plan, and who makes the world a better place. But I know that my answer isn't the answer of everyone. I wanted to find out more about what people thought of masculinity as, so I hit the best place to look I could think of, my school. Hey guys, it's like 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm currently walking to school, and yeah, we're gonna interview people. Now, I really have only one question I want to ask, and that is, when you think of masculinity, what do you think of?
I think of men. Gym bros. Like who go chop wood, like be lumberjacks. Oh, they have a lot of facial hair, yeah. So like do rock climbing and stuff.
I think of toxicity.
Why is that?
Because in media and in life, masculinity is usually portrayed by toxicity, by violence, and by just disrespect, instead of what it could be, which is a positive function of people's personalities.
All the responses, even the not serious ones, were all geared around this idea of macho-ness, this stereotype about masculinity. But the last student you just heard, my friend Maliha, said something really interesting about what she thought of masculinity as, something that almost related to violence. I wanted to talk to a professional about the link between toxic masculinity and violence, so I sat down with Daniel Ellenberg, a licensed psychiatrist here in California, who is a founding member of the Men's Counseling Guild, a group of men who facilitate men's groups and workshops.
What I found early on was that there was this constant thing about having to prove something about masculinity. And indeed, there is a very accepted theory in male psychology, which is called precarious manhood. And precarious manhood has three different parts to it. One is that you must prove masculinity as a male. Two is that once done, if it is done at all, it's easy to lose. And three is that it must be demonstrated in public.
These ideas of like macho-ness almost like transcribe themselves into violence. Could you tell us a little bit about like the psychological link between like these ideas and then like violence and violent tendencies?
Like many things, there's probably some combination of nature and nurture. And nurture, as it turns out, isn't always so nurturing. Of course, the so-called best way of proving masculinity is the willingness to be violent in the extreme. Like, you looked at me the wrong way. Who do you think you are? And it turns into a really negative competition. I prefer the term toxic competitiveness over toxic masculinity, because it's not just about guys here. And the problem isn't so-called masculinity itself. The problem is the enactment of a certain type of masculinity, which is the toxic competitiveness, which is based on hierarchy, proving I am stronger than you are stronger. Everything presents itself, as a kind of a negative competition, and where one can lose, right? And essentially underlying that is a sense of threat.
So I do a lot of work in the media, and and in local government, and one thing we notice in both sectors is that we can talk about, mental health and I guess positive masculinity, but no one really knows what that is.
Part of what's important to do is clarify, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by that guys can be living outside the box? And to me, I think it really has to do with having full access to all human aspects. If I'm crying because I'm touched by something, it just feels like I'm human, right? And I can be moved by things. I can feel sadness and grief about various things that happen.
What is your ideal way to solve this problem?
What we really need to do is expand the operating system, create a new orientation to showing up as guys. And to me, really a big part of that is really opening our hearts, and opening our hearts as being to some degree rewarded, for that rather than punished. Because if guys think that, hey, if I'm really caring towards someone, that makes me less masculine, that's a problem, right? Because then it takes us outside of our human connectedness and puts us into these kind of rigid, role-based ways of orienting.
I feel as though, especially as a teenager, I feel like we're kind of forced to confine in some ways, or at least have a set aesthetic or way to go about like your personality or your gender and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And it's like something that's not only found here in the States. I remember like talking about the idea of like machismo with my like host parents in Ecuador, which is kind of like the word for like toxic masculinity there. It's very interesting seeing how the same word exists in so many different places and how we all deal with it. I think it's even funnier that I was mentioning how I was spending a lot of my time rock climbing and crocheting, two things that might seem like on complete opposite sides of that spectrum of masculinity. I remember like telling friends that I started crocheting and they're like, what the heck? That's so like masculine, or like that's so unmanly. And I'm like, what? That's not necessarily the case.
I agree with you 100% on that.
It's so important to recognize that there is no clear binary when it comes to masculinity, and the same can really be said about gender identity.
That leads us to our next story. Riona, a student reporter from Maryland, wanted to explore this, so she interviewed a student at her school who identifies as a young trans man. We aren't using their name to respect their privacy.
Could you tell me a little bit about your experience transitioning?
So I came out for the first time when I was in 7th grade. It was not a successful coming out. So basically, I ended up back in the closet for a couple years. And at the start of my freshman year, I started introducing myself with a different name.
Could you tell me how you define the word masculinity?
I guess I think it's kind of a state of being. I don't think it's an inherent trait. I think gender as a whole is a social construct, and I think masculinity is a function of the concept of gender.
Would you consider yourself masculine?
To an extent, yeah. I think I'm probably more feminine than the average teenage guy you would meet because I think I've had more freedom to express myself in different ways. But yeah, I think overall I'd consider myself more masculine. Masculinity, as I perceive it, is more like a presentation-based thing than, character traits. But, I wear men's clothing. I have short hair. So, it's more masculine.
Have you ever felt pressure to conform to society's ideals of masculinity?
Oh, for sure. Yes. I think every day I wake up and I get dressed and I think, how are people going to look at me? Like, this is definitely something that still affects like how I present myself every day. And I think that's true of most trans people and even a lot of cis people, especially, if you're queer in some way. I think that I have spent a lot of time considering how others will look at me in like how I present and carry myself.
A little bit more on that pressure to conform to masculinity. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how that affected you when you were younger, like when you were in middle school?
Yeah. So when I was in middle school, I had long hair. I took really bad care of it because I hated it. That, I think, was a function of the pressure to conform. Women have long hair, men have short hair, conceptually. So like I had long hair, I didn't like it. I did nothing to take care of it. I walked around every day with a low ponytail at like the nape of my neck that I've been told made me look like a founding father. It definitely put a damper on my self-expression and my like capacity to look the way I wanted to. I felt really, really obligated to dress a way that would allow people to perceive me the way I wanted. And I had such a small capacity to do that I did the same thing all the time.
How do you think that your experience with masculinity differs from cis and straight teen guys?
Ooh, a lot of ways. I think I've had a lot more freedom in some ways. I dress, I think, in a much more varied way than the average cis guy. I think I had a lot more freedom to explore my sexuality. I think in like society where it's at right now, it's a lot easier for a young girl to explore her sexuality than it is for a young man in some ways. A lot of masculinity is based around not showing emotions and not showing like differences, whereas like feminine expectations don't really fall into that same category. So I think I had early on an easier go of, figuring out who I was attracted to and who I was not.
How do you think the concept of masculinity affects young people who are questioning their gender identities or are in the process of transitioning?
I think it imposes a really intense rigidity on the ways that people are able to explore themselves. I think also in emotional vulnerability and in being able to explore your sexuality, like I said before, in basically every function of everyday life, there is a prescribed set of ways like to be a man. And I think that our concept of masculinity, like as a society, is super, super stifling to ways that people can express themselves and explore themselves.
Joining us now to talk about Riona's conversation and also his own experience is Matt Suskan, a former host of On Our Minds.
Hey, Matt.
Hi, Bree. It's really nice to be here. So thank you guys for having me. This feels really familiar, so it's a cool feeling.
Well, we really appreciate you for your voicemail message, which we actually played at the top of the show today. In the last piece, we heard the opinion that young men don't have the opportunities to express themselves as freely as young women. So I was wondering, what do you think about that idea, Matt?
I think it's kind of complicated. I do think that young men don't have as many opportunities to express themselves, but at the same time, I feel like there are a few trends that I've seen recently where it's like I feel like it's starting to be celebrated to kind of explore that line, and I think that stuff is really cool and interesting. I think also because I am in college now, I can offer that perspective of like that transition between high school and college. Even coming from a super accepting high school, I feel like in college, it even feels so much more free. People don't really judge you. I think if anything, it would be weird if people were judging you in college. So I feel like for people who are currently in high school and are thinking, I want to try things out, but I feel like this is not the right environment for it, like that time will come.
Well, as a guy, I was actually also curious what you thought were some like hindrances that guys face in exploring like their masculinity or sexuality.
I don't know. I feel like it's just the same stigma that I feel like is starting to be broken down. That's kind of what happened with pronouns, where I feel like just like maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, people started to like introduce themselves with pronouns. And it was a little bit like, oh, like, why are you doing that? I remember. And I feel like it's such the norm now to like introduce yourself with your pronouns. It's like little by little with those seemingly very small things is how you create comfortable environments where people do feel like they can express themselves. But I feel like the people who just kind of look happier are those people who are just more comfortable with themselves and don't really care so much about, oh, like, is this masculine or not?
That is exactly what I was thinking. Like, I feel like it really comes down to that word of like vulnerability. A lot of guys see like being vulnerable as being like more feminine or less masculine, and it's like really not the case. And like you said, you'll see that like you'll find people being a lot happier when they start like letting loose.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with us, Matt. It was just really interesting to hear your perspective, Matt, especially like in college and how James and I were both going to college next year. And just to hear about how freeing it is and how you're kind of able to escape that bubble and able to try new things. It's like really comforting in a way.
All right. Well, thank you guys again for having me. Bye, guys.
Bye, Matt. If you're interested in learning more about psychology, mental health, and well-being, we want to recommend another podcast you might enjoy. It's called Speaking of Psychology, the flagship podcast of the American Psychological Association.
Speaking of Psychology brings listeners some of the biggest names in psychology and highlights the latest, most interesting, and relevant psychological research happening today. Their recent episodes include how to learn from your failures, the brain benefits of being bilingual.
Oh, I love that topic.
Why kids and adults learn best through play, and how to stop the spread of misinformation. Check it out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, how are you feeling about our next episode, James?
I'm feeling pretty good about our next episode and a little excited. I heard that we have someone really special coming up.
The next episode, coming in 2 weeks, is a special conversation with the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Morthy.
We'll talk to him more about social isolation, friendship, social media, and why teen mental health is one of his top priorities.
I am so excited. Speaking of social media, I follow this man on Instagram, and it is the best Instagram account ever. I am obsessed with him and his pickleball photo shoot. That was amazing. Follow his Instagram at u.s.surgeongeneral. On Our Minds Season 4 is produced by Student Reporting Labs in collaboration with KUOW's RadioActive Youth Media.
Today's segments were produced by Nico from Santa Clara, California,
and Riona from Clarksburg, Maryland.
This episode was produced by lead podcast producer Briget Ganske with research and fact-checking by Simran Gupta.
Antonio Nevarez edited and mixed this episode. Approval and oversight by editorial director Marie Kusik and executive producer Leah Clapman.
Theme music by Joseph Broad. Additional music from Blue Dot Sessions.
If you or someone you know needs help, We have a list of resources at studentreportinglabs.org/mental health resources.
One last thing, if you're enjoying On Our Minds, please give us a review.